David Perell, how's everything going, man?
It's going well.
We're in your studio, which is absolutely beautiful. Tell me about like what made you build this thing, and what's the vision of this place? What's going on here?
Yeah, so I think 7 years ago, I was a big fan of Casey Neistat, and he is a YouTuber, had this epic studio in New York, and I always wanted to go to that studio. It had so much personality, and I'd always thought, what would it be like to have a studio like that? And then once I started teaching and really doubling down on rite of passage, which you were a student in, I said, you know what, let's do a studio. Let's really take production of education and let's turn it up to 10. And then also there was a hole in the market where a bunch of people were publishing books and they're going on book tours, and there wasn't anybody who was talking about the process of writing the book. Everybody was talking about the contents of the book. And so I basically said, okay, there's an opportunity to start a podcast and an interview series with authors who are on their book tours. And so that's the eventual goal of this place. And then also I got so tired of every studio having the same sterile minimalist aesthetic with nothing on the walls. And I just tried to ask, what would it look like to have a studio that has a strong maximalist taste? And so spent many months working on it.
Yeah, and it shows. You got all kinds of stuff back here, but let's go back to sort of what brought me to this conversation, which is really about this age of abundance that we're in, right? Like we have way too much information, entertainment options, and things like that. And I think one of the things that I got out of your course is really being more selective about what I let in, and like sort of thinking things differently, because we do come from an age of scarcity, and that transition to abundance definitely changes things. So describe for my audience, like what is this age of abundance, first of all, and how do you sort of navigate it in a way that's intelligent?
Yeah, the age of abundance is what you feel when you're trying to go to sleep and you have this phone next to you that's 2 feet away from your head, and you're like, why can't I sleep? And you have all of the information that has ever been produced in human history that is just right there. You have the vitriol of the modern news cycle. You have all the drama, all the gossip. You have the potential to instantly connect with all the people who you've met and become a Facebook friends with 15 years ago, now people who were in your phone network. And that is so different from the kind of experience that you have if you're living in a rural place and you get the newspaper every day and you got a wall of books. And what happens with the age of abundance is information, and all markets of abundance, like food, is the same way. The returns to responsibility and really deliberate decision making go way up. And so there's something that I call the paradox of abundance, where I think abundance is bad for the median consumer, but really good for the most intelligent ones. Many years ago, I had a conversation with a guy named Charlie Songhurst. And he worked very closely with Bill Gates. He was on the executive team at Microsoft, and he's now been an angel investor for many years. And I said, Charlie, what is one of the biggest things that you've noticed about how the world is changing? And he said that the very smartest young people are so much smarter than they were at the same age 30 years ago. And it's that access to abundance. But at the same time, we see people just get totally swept away, like a wave hitting you when you're not very experienced in the ocean, and just getting floored by gossip, by celebrity drama. And the most pernicious one of them all is the news, which seems so important in the moment, but really isn't as important as the media companies tell you that it is.
And we're bombarded with this on a daily basis. And it's almost like they're trying to hack into our brain to see, what we'll respond to. And they produce more of that, which is why we get lots of listicles everywhere. Yeah. So how do how do you navigate this? Because what we're getting right now is, I don't know, we're essentially eating lots of, sugary drinks or something like that, rather than anything that's actually good for us. How do we change our information diet?
Yeah, so I'd love to hear from you and what you do here, because I think that you do a really good job of this. But I think that there's a few little tricks that I have. So the first is, I'll go from most tactical to least tactical. So the first thing that I do is I only read through Read It Later apps and through the Kindle. And so I think the Read It Later apps is the most interesting. So my friend Tiago calls it the reactivity loop. So you'll be scrolling on social media or you'll be going through your email and you'll see an article and somebody will say, this is really important, must read, breaking news, right? And you'll say, oh, I need to read this now. So stop what you're doing and you'll instantly read that thing. Don't do that. Don't do that. Save it into another place, a central location where all of your articles are saved, and then make a deliberate choice from 8 to 10 p.m. or something to say, okay, now I'm going to read. And then you're only choosing from things that you've saved to read later. And so you'll see that you're in a much more sober state. And now you can be much more discerning with what you choose to read and what to avoid. I'd say that's the first big thing. And then the other thing is just to appreciate how much of society's recommendations are oriented towards the now. The entire gravity of the internet, the way that we've designed it, is based off of recency bias. And I think this is terrible for society. Because what it does is, as a creator, it makes you publish all the time, which lowers the quality of content that's produced. And as a consumer, it privileges news and things that have been published in the last 24 hours at the cost of great books that have been written. You're in here in my studio right now. I'm looking around. I think there's one book that has been published in this decade. And that's a very intentional choice to basically remind myself, to remind readers to not be so attached to what just came out and to really focus on the wisdom of history. Because, we're talking about the phone being right next to you. You have the great writings of history right there. You have Nietzsche, you have Plato, you have all those sorts of people. And yet we default to what some journalist wrote on a 3-hour deadline this morning and that they published impulsively because they were feeling moved just in this one morning of one day. And I just think that the relative weighting of what we read in the present versus the wisdom of history is just absurd.
And that's an orientation towards now is what we would call, I guess, in economics or even in Bitcoin, like high time preference.
Totally
behavior,
perfect.
Right? And that's in contrast to sort of like the low time preference books that we're looking at. But of course, like they're not nearly as sweet, right? It's more like nutritious meat or something like that. I guess for the people listening to this or watching this, what recommendation would you give to get them to want to, read the more meaty stuff, the, philosophers of old and great books that were written 500 years ago, rather than, a fun listicle that you can, mention to your friends and, have a fun conversation about, I guess?
Yeah. I mean, I think that it's hard to answer that question in general. I'd have to know for each individual person. Take a writer though, because that's usually who I'm speaking to. If somebody wants to write on the internet, what I would say is this is going to give you a bunch of advantages in that you're going to be reading things that other people aren't reading, and the ideas that you're going to be drawing from are going to be more rooted and they're going to have more intellectual weight. And so it's basically the difference between like an Amazon Basics steak knife and like one of the best steak knives that you can possibly get. Like they're both steak knives, but the really good one will have a weight. It'll cut like butter. It'll be fit for purpose and all these sorts of things. And it's not like this switch. It's not binary where you just go from reading, being stuck in what I call the never ending now, where we're constantly spinning on this treadmill of what's been created recently to something that's more timeless. It's a relative change, but over time, what happens is your tastes become more refined. I remember favorite dessert I ever had was a chocolate mousse when I was like 12 or 13 years old. I had 4 bites of it and I was done. And the entire mousse was that small. But it was at a French restaurant with extremely rich chocolate. And it was high quality. You don't need a lot of it. And what we end up doing as a society is we end up binge eating Sour Patch Kids. And it's stuff that gives you a really quick dopamine rush and adrenaline spike. And then you eat so much of it, but it doesn't have that lasting, it's beyond sweetness, the depth of a really good chocolate mousse.
That's interesting. It reminds me of like a scene from Perell. Have you read that book?
No.
Okay, it's the middle book of C.S. Lewis's space trilogy. But he goes to Venus and he's like eating this fruit that's really delicious. But one in every 10 or so, there's a fruit that tastes especially good, right? And he comments in the book that if they had this on Earth, they'd figure out a way to breed just the one that's the tastiest. But what he says in the book is, but all of the ones that didn't have it made the one that was especially sweet like that much better. It's if you just go to the part of the song that you really like the height of a symphony or something like that, and just listen to that over and over, it just doesn't sound the same as if you had to sort of like wait in anticipation. And he actually posits in the book, like, this is the root of all sin. Like the desire to get something at an inappropriate level, which is like a form of greed or something like that. At least that's what I remember. I don't know. But that idea of sort of like binging on something because you liked it rather than sort of like restraining yourself. It's a very, very different sort of like mentality than what we have, right?
Yeah. So let me take the same idea and give you a little bit of a different take on it. So I'm looking at The Power Broker by Robert Caro. And what that book does is every individual moment of that book isn't trying to give me peak attention, but the totality of that book taught me so much about power, taught me so much about New York City, and changed my relationship with the world profoundly. And so I think sometimes when you don't need to optimize for the perfection, the maximize every individual moment, you can actually create something that in unison has more depth and more weight to it.
Yeah, and as a result, you get something that you wouldn't otherwise get if you're just sort of in that now. And I don't know, there's maybe an appreciation of the peaks that you get more of if you had to sort of like build up to it instead of sort of constantly being there. I don't know. Maybe that's like what the root of like being bipolar or whatever it is. It's this addiction to the high, and then you just sort of have to fall off. There's a natural rhythm to these things that maybe we're not appreciating. Maybe that's the main idea here.
Yeah, and it's hard to like. Maybe you talk about your love for the Sistine Chapel, because I think that can answer this, right? The Sistine Chapel, it's not giving you, I mean, in some senses, it has this it's just magnificent, but in another sense, it has this depth where you can go see it, and then you can think on it, see it and think on it. You can zoom into one part of it, and then the whole totality of it is its own experience. But that kind of art is, I don't want to call it anti-modern, but it's very different from what is now created.
Well, I would call it anti-modern because the modern is based on this sort of like instant gratification, immediate sort of fulfillment of some very surface level need or something like that, rather than something with a lot more depth or something that has, I don't know, a long-term implication, something to that effect. And that seems to me the crucial difference is that in a lot of the stuff that we are bombarded with, it tastes good now, but, moment on the lips, lifetime on the hips kind of information, rather than, something that goes much further and like sort of develops character, gives you a refined palette from sort of an information perspective.
Yeah. What's weird is just seeing these same patterns persist everywhere. So like if you look at something as benign, as mundane as door handles, go to a 18th century, 19th century, would be 19th century chateau in France. Like the door handles have a ornamentation, a sophistication, and a density to them that now the ones that you find at Lowe's and Home Depot, they don't have. Now they tend to be light and flimsy and trendy. And what's funny is, the biggest thing that you learn if you spend time away from the internet, I spent like 2 weeks away from the internet earlier this year, and you come back and it's just amazing how much of the internet is just telling you what is happening right now is something you need to focus on. And it is like telling you what to do, how to think, how to be, how to live, all these sorts of things. It's just like adds so much. It's just like this energy spike. And if you just spend time in nature and you just watch the seasons sort of evolve, or the days just sunrise, sunset, sunrise, sunset, you just realize that the scale of the time is like elongated in the way that the world actually works, and the internet has like shrunk it. And so I think you see higher time preference in terms of currency and the shift to fiat. I think you see something similar, higher time preference in terms of the internet due to the incentive structures of it.
Yeah, and that's a very modern thing, right? Like, and there's a demand for that, which I, in a sense, is a little bit artificial because I mentioned earlier, it feels like they're hacking into our brains, right? And saying, okay, this, they A/B test absolutely everything. What will get more people to click? And it's really much more about impulse or, what will get them to go take that action rather than, what they really actually want. I know so many people that are reading things on the internet that are miserable, right? Because in part because they're reading stuff that is, like, if it bleeds, it leads, I guess, or something like that. So that to me is the essence of the modern way. Let's go back. What's the traditional way in which we consumed information, and how can we bring some of that back? Because in a sense, I feel like we're a lot more a lot shallower, and we could use a lot more depth, especially in how we think about, the world and all that is in it.
Yeah. I mean, I'll just give it to you straight up. If it was published in the last 5 years, don't read it. Just try that. Right? Like that sentence is so like, what? But I'm kind of just being provocative to prove a point. And I read stuff that was published today or yesterday all the time, right? I'm not saying, okay, you need these steadfast rules for yourself, but go a week, go a month. If it was published in the last 5 years, don't read it. Or what if you just experimented with, you're just going to live different decades. So for 1 month, you're only going to listen to stuff, watch stuff, read stuff from the 1970s, 1980s the next month, 1990s the month after that, or go back even farther. And so I think that that's one thing. And then the other thing is, I think that finding ways to just read physical stuff will take you out of that loop. Get the phone away from you. I mean, this is all standard stuff now, but getting away from reading on your screen immediately when somebody sends something to you, that is a huge place to begin. And over time, your taste improves. So you can tell when a piece of writing is cheap and it's flimsy. And I think also just getting more sensitive to the quality of writing. It is astonishing how much good writing is correlated with high quality information. And I mean that in terms of the thoughtfulness that goes into a sentence and a paragraph and specific word choice. It's like the filigree on a building. And you can only start really focusing on those design choices once the building itself is sturdy. And once you've read enough, you can just instantly tell if somebody is trying to sound like a good writer or if somebody actually is a good writer. And there's just a high correlation between good writing and good information.
So reading, I guess, more beautiful writing will improve your taste and maybe make you a little more low time preference in your information consumption
And then
choices.
also just writing. Like, you know, one of the things, so I spent the weekend with a friend who is a really avid cook. And one of the things that he was telling me, and you'll appreciate this, so he's obsessed with making steaks. And he's like, you know, he's got his ultimate grill. He spends like 40 hours prepping the steak, you know, like dinner Saturday begins Friday afternoon. So, you know, we're salting the steak, we're putting seasoning on it, we're putting it through this whole process of preparation. And he looks at me and he says two things. First of all, the kind of steak that I can make at my house is so much better than the best steak that even the best steakhouse can make. Not because I'm really good, because economically it just doesn't make sense for these steakhouses to spend 40 hours working on a steak. But the other thing is that once you start cooking, your understanding of what goes into food goes up, and you realize how important ingredients are. So I said, hey, are you just buying the steak from the local grocery store? He's like, no. I found a ranch in Iowa. It gets shipped from Iowa to where I live, and this is the best steak for me. And I say all this because reading and writing has the same relationship. That when you're writing a lot, you realize that, okay, the ingredients are really important for what goes into your writing. Okay, so now how do I find better ingredients? And then you start really refining your taste for what kinds of books have the right ingredients, all the way down to, like, this is ridiculous, but like certain books with that font aren't going to have good ideas. And like you end up sort of just picking up a book. You're like, okay, this font is like the wrong font for really good thinking. And you just develop all these heuristics, and you're never perfect, but you're just sort of asymptotic towards what's going to get better and better, and having higher quality information that you're consuming, which is like those ingredients for the steaks.
I do find that when I am writing more, I just consume less.
Totally.
And maybe that's part of the process. But like a lot of people aren't writers, right? So what do you say to them? Like, how do you maybe even get started writing, or how do you refine your palate so that, you know, you start eating stuff that's healthier for you?
Yeah. Well, it's hard to say, because I think that what I have noticed, like if you study art, which is like, especially painting, I'm very interested in, basically every painter who I've studied, almost all of them, have been very, you can see their influences in their work. And so I do think that making stuff in that medium is as close to a panacea as you'll find. The other thing that I would say is, you know, then you can just you could just tap into 7 sins, right? You could say, okay, pride and vanity, you're going to be the smartest person at the party. Envy, you're going to be as smart as the smartest kid in the class who used to say, I want that person. I don't like them because they're so much smarter than me. Greed, you're going to actually have all the best ideas in your mind. You're going to think better than everybody else. And so I think that maybe we can use the worst parts of human nature for good here.
So that's the motivation, I guess, for refining your taste, and maybe doing a little bit better, I guess, writing on the internet or something like that. Well, so let's go back to sort of taking in whatever it is that you are reading, and assuming that it's really high quality stuff. What do you do to really get the most out of it? Because oftentimes, like, you know, if we treat, you know, an older work that has a lot of depth to it the same way we do a listicle that we read, that's probably not going to fly. So I suspect that your mentality or how you approach the words has to be different. What are some things that we can do there?
So I'll tell you, the first one is, you don't need, people treat books with way too much seriousness. Like, a book is like a novel. Sure, you want to start from the beginning, but you can pick up many books at the chapter that you like. Skip a chapter if you don't like it and just dive into something that resonates. I love biographies. I hate the beginning of biographies until I know stuff about the person. So I've been really into the work of Walt Disney. So I started at the creation of Disneyland because I'd just gotten back from Disneyland. So I'm like starting 450 pages into his biography. I work up to page 600, and then I can always go back if I want to. And so I think treat books with less seriousness. You don't need to read from the beginning to the end. And then the other thing that I'm always trying to think about in my reading is just reading. Like, you don't need to read that much. I think that I spend a decent time reading, but when I find something good, I follow that. So if I'm reading about, for example, take a painter like Cezanne. Okay, so Cezanne is working in southern France. Okay, so he goes to Paris. Okay, so interesting. There's this cafe in Paris where a bunch of these people were working, these painters. Okay, now let's just go on Wikipedia and let's just follow that trail. And so I see books as not just as like, how do I download this information, but first of all, as like an entry point into all of these other ideas that I couldn't find that I'm then going to go follow and find that thing, but also as just creating this space that I can think in. And if I read a book, I think just as much as like, what are the thoughts I'm going to have while I read the book as can I extract the information from it?
And that's something that I've realized about your note-taking system that's a little bit different. It's not necessarily about summarizing, hey, this is what the author said in the paragraph. It's, okay, here's an interesting idea. Let me jot down some ideas that this triggers in my head, write that down, and then, get it imported into some sort of note capture. But that to me was like a very different way of reading, where you're reading to generate ideas,
of course,
and not to necessarily know everything. Well, I mean, hopefully you're understanding what the author is saying, but it's like a creative reading and not an absorbing of whatever the person is saying.
Well, look at the way a painter goes to an art museum. They take their easel, they take a stand, they have their paintbrush, and they paint to try to replicate what they're looking at. And they'll sketch it out, or they'll try to do a perfect replication. And so I think that often people think of the difference between consumption and creation as like these two separate modes of society or of life, right? It's like I have my consumption time and then I have my creation time. And I say, actually, while you're consuming, what can you create? And if you get inspired, go follow that. Or you can take notes and write a little note in Kindle, for example, about, okay, why is this of interest? Go do that. Go write 150 words about why something resonated with you. And as you're reading, start thinking, okay, what ideas are coming to life? I think one of the great perils of the modern note-taking movement is that it's so oriented towards capturing other people's ideas and should be more focused on capturing your own ideas as well and thinking about how other people's ideas and your own begin to interplay.
Yeah, and that's the important thing, right? In a sense, this is the stuff that you want to explore and think about and sort of be much more active about as you read something. Is what thoughts does it trigger? And in that way, it almost feels like you can read a book twice and get a very different experience, because you're going to have different thoughts that come in and different ways of looking at it based on whatever you happen to be thinking about. So what are some I think what you had described is sort of like it makes the process of reading a creative endeavor. It's almost like sanctifying reading or sanctifying consumption in a way. For a lot of people, this isn't something that they do normally, right? Like where they'll go and write things down. And that in itself is like a very difficult sort of step for them to take. It is to write something down about, oh, that here's an interesting thought or something, or maybe their brain doesn't work that way. What are some effective things that have worked that you've seen for people that don't note take or try to like read in a creative manner or something like that?
Yeah, I think that one of the best things you can do is just spend time walking. I think that a lot of what we've been talking about is this sort of very direct relationship between reading and writing, and having them oscillate, just the oscillation of those two things being very tight. But there is this weird paradox of reading that the books that you read radically change your life, even though you'll forget most of what you read. And there's a way that information doesn't just register in the conscious, easy to recall part of your brain, but something deeper inside of who you are and your identity, your being. And I do find that just having the free time, the free space to just follow the wandering trails of your creative spirit is really a worthy activity, and to not be so obsessed with the utility of your curiosity. I think that's one of the failure points in society right now is we don't actually trust curiosity enough, and we actually try to suppress it. There's all kinds of examples. Newton, first of all, was into alchemy, and a lot of his early ideas about the nature of physics people saw as nonsense. And I haven't studied Newton enough, but I wouldn't be surprised if some of his superfluous wanderings into alchemy ended up helping him think better about the nature of the universe, even if those two things can't quite be quantified, the relationship between them. I'm not sure, but it's something I'd look into. And then the other thing is, if you just look at school curriculums, it's all very sort of rational. Kids need to learn math, need to learn this, need to learn that, all these sorts of things. And by trying to standardize school instruction, we've taken out a lot of the places where kids can just be really curious. I mean, think about how you learn, and I know this from hanging out with you. Every time I'm with you, I feel like you're on to something new. There's some new trail that you're following, and it's like, what's Jimmy going to be obsessed with today? And it's all sort of wrapped inside of this context, which I think is the twin pillars that are central to your work, which are God and Bitcoin. But you always kind of bring it back to that. But actually, the thing that you are really, the beam that you're riding is very rarely directly on both of those two things. But imagine how much less you would enjoy your own learning if I said, Jimmy, you can't learn what you want this week. You have to follow this curriculum that I've laid out for you. You wouldn't be happy. And so I think that there's just a trust and curiosity that we need to adopt and embrace.
Yeah, that's a great point. I do feel like we just sort of like beat the curiosity out of kids through forcing them to learn stuff that they're not really interested in. And and for me, that's the big thing about teaching that is so different than what I thought it was when I was going to elementary school or whatever. You saw just sort of like an authority figure in the middle, and they told you what you had to learn. Whereas when I'm teaching my classes or something like that, I get a bunch of students that are motivated to learn whatever it is I'm teaching. In my case, it's Bitcoin. In your case, it's writing. And it's so much of a better experience because they want to know stuff and you have the information and they're eager to absorb it because they're very curious about it, as opposed to, the typical, graduate school or, any level of school where it's, all right, how do I get an A? And that's really all they care about. So tell me about how you handle this problem with curiosity. Like what because I think for a lot of people what ends up happening is that they aren't curious about much at all, except what's sort of like immediately in front of them. Oh, what's this listicle gonna say? And then, maybe feel some outrage or something like that. Because that seems to be at the core of what we're talking about is there's a curiosity that's natural that's been killed, and there's an artificial curiosity that's sort of taken over.
Mm-hmm. I think that there's something deeper than curiosity here that I think I know you have. Mm-hmm. And it is a desperate thirst for knowledge with the end goal of understanding how the world works. And I think that if there's anything that is a theme in our conversations, it is just some kind of march towards truth and trying to transcend what either of us are able to figure out on our own and collaboratively play in the sandbox that exists in the frontier of both of our minds and say, what happens if we can pair up through conversation? What can we learn about the world together? And I think a lot of that is personality. I think that a lot of that is some sort of genetic magnetism towards trying to understand the world that we have. But at the same time, I just want to stop those people, and I want to say sort of two things. The first is, like, look at how fascinating the world is. Like, the world is just a fascinating place. And I think this is why it's important to do things in the world too. I think that, there is a kind of person who does well in the academy, who does well in just a world of sheer contemplation. That doesn't work super well for my personality. My curiosity is so often, okay, I have problems that I need to solve. Then I want to get information to figure out that problem. Then I begin to learn and synthesize those ideas. Then I begin to do better in the world. Then I come up to a new problem and I'm like, oh, wow, this flywheel is really starting to spin. And I think the best example of this is how many men have gotten into ideas because they started learning on the internet so that they could date better, because they couldn't pick up chicks and they were going to parties and they were just getting rejected. And all of a sudden they came across the world of dating and they were like, hey, this is really interesting. And now all of a sudden they're going to parties, they're getting attention, and they're like, okay, now where else can I apply this? And then they start thinking about how they can do better. I think that that's one of those things that's really under discussed, and that whole world of the dating blogosphere is a big entry point into intellectual curiosity.
Not just intellectual curiosity. There's a whole sort of like self-improvement that happens after that, right? And
let's get ripped.
And it's interesting because it's we were conditioned, at least 20 years ago, we were conditioned very differently to think about dating this way, think about, what you're supposed to do. Turns out that a lot of it is just kind of propaganda for somebody else's benefit. That's, and a lot of men have, young men especially, have sort of discovered this and said, okay, like I need to do something differently. Or how can I find something that's actually effective? And they become way more curious, not just about that, but once you have some success sort of thinking for yourself, they seem to go and apply it to other places. That seems to be sort of like the pattern for curiosity. Am I right? Like finding some success, learning on your own, and then realizing, okay, maybe I can apply this to some other stuff where it's not working in my life. So how do you get that? What's like, because for me, like dating isn't a great entry point for, I mean, it can be if you, especially because a lot of young men want to date and they want somebody, and it's sort of like a desperate need for them. Although, that's another whole conversation. what other sort of entry points that are practical can you think of that would work?
I almost want to like question the premise of what you're asking here, and take there's the famous Rousseau line: "Man is born free, and everywhere is in chains." That's nonsense. But if we took the same sentence structure, "Man is born curious, but everywhere is made uncurious," I think is much more right. And the question I have for you is, aren't your kids pretty curious naturally? Isn't that a very natural disposition that we have as human beings? And then aspects of that get beaten out of us. I mean, you're clearly very concerned about this because you send your kids to one of the most innovative schools I know. And so this is clearly something you've picked up on.
Yeah, I mean, I do feel like it is beaten out of them, and as a parent, this is something that I do want to like stoke in them is okay. How can I get you to be more curious and want to learn? Because the desire to learn is not easy to stoke, even though it's there naturally. Once it's been beaten out, they're very hesitant to go and learn something, especially if their parent tells them. Which is why I'm asking that question. It's, okay, you have the dating thing, which works for a lot of young men. Yeah, there are lots of women too. There's also, men that are already married or with somebody or whatever. What other entry points? Or
making money?
Yeah.
Making money. I mean,
Okay.
I think that is the big one. How many kids now get really into ideas through buying and selling sneakers on the internet? Okay, so like, I think that this is one of the things I'm most excited about when I become a dad is like when will be the moment that my kid has something that they're interested in that I think is nonsense, that I'm not interested in, and how can I basically like bend their curiosity with that into something useful and relevant. So for example, take something like selling sneakers. Okay, so you want to sell the cool Virgil Abloh Air Force One special edition at a good markup. Okay, so let's talk about stocks and how trading on the internet happens. Let's talk about economics. Let's talk about what actually creates and generates demand. Okay, so now that we know that, let's start thinking about predicting what shoes, once they drop and we can get them for retail price, how do we begin to predict which ones of those shoes are going to go up in value the most? And now you start playing this game of, okay, there are a bunch of, by learning more, knowing more about the world, you can then go make more money. Now your kid has a little bit of money in their piggy bank and they're like, whoa, this learning thing is pretty cool. And I think that making money is something that kids know that money is important in the world. And once they get into high school, I think in particular, and they have access to the internet, they're like, hey, I can actually use making money to start being curious. And I think that that's one of the interesting things about crypto and about the Robinhood movement and about just the consumerification of stocks and trading, which, there's good things, there's bad things about it. But I think this is one of the plus sides, is that it truly has been democratized. And so kids start learning about economics and stuff at a younger age. They don't think of it in that language, but that's fine.
Yeah, I mean, I do feel like way too many of them get into altcoin trading, which I think is actually like horrible for them. You said that. So, yeah. But there is that curiosity, and as a parent, it's it would frighten me if my kid was into altcoins and like pumping random stuff and posting and trying to manipulate other people or something like that. But that actually does happen. So but I do catch what you're saying. Like, making money is a huge motivator and a driver for curiosity. And, I think you also mentioned a lot of the, deadly sins as sort of like a motivator for a lot of people to, know something or to prove somebody wrong or to whatever. in a sense that seems a little bit depressing, because I I want a more positive reason, I guess, to go and learn stuff. And I don't know, maybe I'm being a little more idealistic.
Look, I think that the positive reasons come, and I'm not saying that you need to tap into these base level desires necessarily, but these are the things I'd say to people who aren't curious. That's the first thing. And then the second thing is, I think that as you begin to learn, as you begin to cultivate a sense for beauty and actually appreciate quality, that then becomes something that you pursue for its own end. But emphasis on the word becomes. I didn't have this until much later. And it took me a long time of trying to pursue things only as a means until I could pursue them as an end.
And what does that feel like? What's the sort of end game for the people that are listening? Like, what does that get you? How does it enrich your life or make it better by having, I don't know, that curiosity as an end and being able to pursue those things?
I mean, it adds such a, it's hard to put this in rational language, but it adds a real depth to the world. I mean, there's a painting called Notre Dame de la Garde by Paul Signac, my favorite painting in the world. I think it was painted in 1906. And I flew to Marseille in southern France to just sit where the painting was made. And because I was going to southern France, I ended up going and going to Aix-en-Provence, which where a lot of these painters were, especially Cézanne was in Aix. And I told our tour guide that I was interested in this stuff, and he took me to the very place, the little plateau where Cézanne painted over and over again this famous painting of the mountain, which is the beginning of Cubism. And so just in that trip, I see this sort of late Impressionism that is in Signac, this early Cubism of Cézanne, and you can actually see how there's different ways of looking at the world and like these shifts in consciousness that happen at the beginning of the 20th century. And you can begin to see this interplay between what you've seen on these paintings, then what you read in the books to prepare for the trip, then what you actually see when you're there. And then all of a sudden, now I was reading this paper about Cézanne couple days ago, and I've actually been to the places where the paper is talking about, and now you're in these compounding loops where the world is becoming richer and more magnified, and it's like, you know, the scale of color in the world, it's like Photoshop, is almost getting turned up, it's getting brighter. And you know, so often the reasons that the world feels stale or uninteresting isn't that it's just that you lack knowledge about it. And what's so fun to do is walk around with somebody who is an expert in a place, who is an expert in a thing, and all of a sudden they start seeing things that you don't see. You know, like go walk around, something as simple as like go walk around your apartment building with an architect. And all of a sudden they'll start telling you about, okay, that's really interesting. This, they tried to save money. Hey, that's a really good way to think about that. Oh, we did this because in Texas, the climate is like this. And so it's actually all comes back to materials. And then you just start working. Like the world is so rich, and knowledge becomes the key that you use to unlock that richness.
So there's a more depth to life, I guess, maybe. Or
it makes the world pop. Like it just does. You know, like if you don't know anything, I guess at one level, like there is the youthfulness of not knowing things, which is fun, which is wow. Then that's sort of walking around in a constant state of being astonished. And so that's fine. But then later on, and that's great. Like that's a lovely part of time, part of life, doing new things. But then later on, you end up with like this appreciation, this understanding, and there's something really fun about that too, because you can piece things together and you can begin to constellate ideas from different sectors of society. My goodness, you become creative. You start making things, and now you've made something beautiful, and then other people are complimenting you on it. I'm struggling to point to any specific thing. It all really is about this loop of I have a problem in my life. I learned something. Okay, now I am doing a better job of solving that problem. So then the next time I have the problem, and then that loop you spins around and around, and it just becomes intoxicating to cycle around it.
So, I think what you're arguing for is it's just a richer life rather than sort of like a moment to moment one, but one that's deeper because you focused on the long term things, and you have a lower time preference. Well, I think that's a good place to maybe end this. But where can people find you? Where can people contact you?
So my website is perell.com, Perell.com. But one of the things that I would recommend for people is just search my name, David Perell, and then search Friday Finds Links. I've been collecting my favorite links on the internet for the last 5 years, and I describe them all. And that page must be 40,000, 50,000 words worth of recommendations. And if you go Friday Finds Links, you'll find something that you like.
Indeed, I subscribe to that. So, thanks for talking with me.
Thanks, Jimmy. So, Jimmy, what do you think? You were a rite of passage student, and you really gave it your all. What do you think it takes to succeed in rite of passage?
Yeah, I think for having observed a bunch of other students and stuff, I think the biggest thing is just like commitment and time. And that's something that not a lot of people, not everyone wants to do because, they have busy lives or it's not a priority for them. But if you're really actually curious and want to improve at the craft, you're going to have to do some stuff that you don't want to do. And it's that commitment to doing some of the stuff that you don't want to do that really makes you improve. I think, in a sense, like you have to get through the boring part to really produce something awesome. And that, you have to sort of have that mentality. It's not going to be, fun and games, kind of like amusement park experience. I don't know if that's the expectation some people come in with, but there's work, and you got to be willing to put in the work, and that would be the number one thing that I think will get people to really get the most out of it.
I think for you, what really stood out was your commitment to publishing consistently.
Well, I published, I think, once a day, right? Yeah. And that wasn't easy, let me tell you, but it's kind of like the best coaches and whatever. So I was reading about a soccer coach that just runs his players ragged during practice, right? He's like, you have to do these like full length sprints, and like a lot of the players can't do it, and they like lie down for a few minutes and then join back and try it or whatever. And the reason why he trains his players that way is because after you've done that, then it like the games are easy. So in a way, this is what you want to be able to do is if you can publish a bunch of things in rite of passage, then you get asked to go write something like 1,000 words contributing to something. You can do it, and it's not that hard because you've sort of pushed yourself, so you have that endurance. And I would suggest that getting to that point of getting your 4 pieces out, right? Like that's the model. If you can get 4 publishable things out of this class, then you're publishing like one thing a month. It's gonna feel really easy or much easier, and that's where you want to be, where things come easier because you've done much harder.
How has your writing process changed from before you took the course to after?
Yeah. So before I would sit there staring at a blank page until words came, and that's a very hard way to, and a very harsh way to write. It's not very enjoyable. It feels like, you're kind of like pressing yourself to like have a creative thought, right? And that it's I mean I've done it enough times where I just sort of dread it and go do it anyway. But I think after the course, the main thing that changed is I'm now writing from abundance. So I have a lot of ideas, and there's a process that I've developed, I think, having published so many things, where it's okay, just jot down some ideas, just get started, right? Like, and getting started is oftentimes like the hardest part for me. That's the point where I get stuck a lot. And I don't want to get started because, I don't know, I dread that feeling or whatever. But jotting down notes, it feels much easier. And just a few ideas, whatever it is, just write down 3 ideas about this essay that you want to write. And, I might have like 7 or 8. And I know how many words each idea now takes. And then like order them, right? Like make sort of like a map or something like that of how to get from point A to point B. And then sort of flesh that out more fully. And it doesn't feel like you're staring at a blank page because you've sort of like developed the skeleton first, and you're just sort of putting meat on the bones afterwards. And, I hated that process of that first draft. It's a little more enjoyable because now I just sort of like have interesting ideas, and it's like, okay, let's see if it makes it in, or if it doesn't, that's okay too. And it's so much easier to get something out than it used to, where like I would be staring at a blank page.
Yeah. What idea from the course, what concept has stuck with you the most?
Writing from abundance definitely was the biggest one, because I think like getting into this info capture idea, but it's not necessarily information from other people. It's my own thoughts, and I've had so many different ideas, and then I'd forget them or whatever. Now I have some place where I can capture them, and I can go back and search for them, and I can grab certain things, and it's oftentimes not even about the idea really, or having them really super well organized or anything like that. It's this habit of thinking of ideas, and once you have that, then you can generate ideas a lot easier because you're in that mode of, okay, what thoughts do I have about this? So it's changed me as a reader, because it used to be that I would just read for the information. Now I read, and every once in a while I'll pause. It's like, oh, that was interesting, I need to jot that down. Idea generation comes so much easier for me now. And it wasn't like I was bad at it before, but I have an abundance of ideas. And you give me a topic and I can like come up with 5 or 6 things. Okay, that's actually enough for an essay. I don't even need to go back to my notes. That habit is actually very valuable to go and develop. It's a muscle that you need, especially in any creative endeavor where you have this ability to come up with ways to look at the world in a different way and capture them, and then make an essay out of it, and have some cohesion around it. That for me was very valuable, like practicing and exercising those muscles.
Can you talk about some of the ways that your writing career has changed since you've taken the course? You're now writing a regular column for Bitcoin Magazine. What else has happened?
Well, so that's the main one, and I guess I'm writing a little more purposefully with my newsletter. I moved that to paid, so I'm getting paid for stuff that I was doing for free. The column for Bitcoin Magazine, I'm going to probably turn that into a book in the next few months. I'll definitely turn it into a book. Just the timeline, I'm not entirely sure on yet. But having sort of this ability to come up with essays on a given topic and being able to think through ideas, it's almost like an improv class for a comedian or something like that, where you just practice so much that you can just come up with stuff. I feel like that was a large part of rite of passage. It's I've gotten better at idea generation. I've gotten better at sort of like developing those ideas into sort of like a nice chunk of text that explains it clearly, uses analogies, maybe adds a joke in there, varies it. So there's like, it's more pleasant to read. There's more craft. I can still work on a lot of that stuff, but there's at least a framework by which I can sort of judge, okay, this is a good paragraph. That's not a good paragraph, or that's an interesting thought. That's not an interesting thought. And those have definitely helped me to, I don't know, make my writing better, I guess. I don't. It feels better for me. I don't know about my readers.
Did that come from pop writing? Was it pop writing that changed how you wrote?
Yeah, so I never really wrote to entertain, which I think pop writing definitely added, and that wasn't a perspective that I really had. And I started inserting jokes into my writing, and it just read way better, and it was a lot more fun for people to read, and it made me more proud of my work. That's a dimension that I think I didn't really get or understand until it was like, oh, okay, you want to sort of like change the emotional tone here and like get people to laugh, because the thing about like laughter is that it sort of bypasses a lot of the circuits of like, okay, critically examining something. And my writing before that was very expository or argumentative or something like that. Most of the time, if you just come up with that like one really good analogy or a good joke or something like that, it devastates the thing that you're making fun of without needing to go through a detailed argument on why. And it's a lot more fun to read, a lot less sort of like straining for the reader to like think through. So that was definitely a part that I've tried to adapt into my writing. And I've read several books on like how to come up with good jokes and things like that. And that's a part that I still need to work on, but it's been fun. Yeah.
And talk about some of the people who you met in Rite of Passage. Was there a particular person, a particular conversation that you had during the course that really stuck out?
Well, I mean, I talked to everybody. I reviewed a lot of stuff, and there were a lot of people that gave me a lot of encouragement on the pop writing, especially. They were like, "Oh, dude, that was awesome. I really enjoyed that." And it's like, "Oh, okay. I need to do a little bit more of this." The main thing I think from Rite of Passage that I appreciate as a writer, which I don't know if everybody does, is the feedback that you get from other writers is qualitatively different than you get from a typical reader. So reader feedback, don't get me wrong, is very useful, but when you get feedback from other writers, that's gold, and that's something that you should pay very close attention to. And for me, at least, that's worth the price of the course, is getting other sort of like people reviewing it and reading it and giving you sort of like tips on how to make it better. For me, that was a lot of different people, and I wrote so much that I got just so much different feedback. It's hard to like single out a single person and say, hey, that person really helped me. It's that process of learning like what works and what doesn't, and getting sort of like rapid feedback. And if you haven't experienced that in some aspect of your life, like you really need to experience that to really know. But for example, you're learning how to play an instrument or something like that. Really good coach or somebody that can give you effective feedback. Hey, go from this and do this instead of this. you're transitioning from one note, like keep the finger there, or do this or whatever. Those are the things that really sort of like accelerate your ability to get better. And we live in a society that tells us, hey, you need to do everything on your own. Actually, like getting good coaching is how you get better really fast. And this is, I think, ultimately the role of the teacher. And in a sense, you don't have one teacher, it's actually like 30 teachers, or however many. And that's the real valuable part. That's where you improve, and that's where you become a better writer.
How would you describe my involvement in Rite of Passage?
Well, you produced the videos, you did the sort of like you're the face of the thing. And you give instruction on what to do next. So, in a sense, you're at the forefront of everything. I would say that your involvement is, I think, necessarily a little bit diluted because there's so many students. The real heart of it comes through peer to peer, or through the mentors and things like that. You get the overall view through your sessions, but the nitty gritty, tiny improvement, it's kind of like a football team or something like that, where you have the head coach, you're like the head coach, but then you have lots of assistant coaches that are like working directly with you and saying, okay, do this instead of this, or try this instead of this. And oftentimes that's where you get the, here's the trick that, maybe you didn't know before, or here's how you applied that, what David said to your writing, and so on. So I would say that your involvement was mostly on here are the principles that you need to learn. The actual application of that, is sort of like lower on the coaching, I guess, scale.
And last question, is there anything from CrossFit for writing that stuck with you, or how would you describe that process?
Yeah, so CrossFit is just doing, right? And oftentimes, like, you're not gonna know what tricks to employ until you're actually doing something. So if you're at football practice or something like that, and you're a lineman, you have to actually block people instead of just knowing all of the theory. So a lot of the week when you're doing rite of passage is, okay, here's the theory, here's how you apply it, and it's the classroom. You're watching film, or you're learning the plays, or whatever. But until you actually go and do, it doesn't really stick. Yep. For me, the CrossFit sessions were really useful because, okay, like, how do I get, a raw idea, generate more ideas, turn that into a map, turn that into an essay, and, a first draft, and then, like getting other people that are there, that are doing it with you, it's massively motivating. But you're also getting to actually do this stuff, and it's timed, and there's a process, and you get more used to the actual process. Still use a lot of the processes from CrossFit. So very useful and important part of the course, and you should definitely try it if you haven't.
Is there anything else you want to say?
It was a very fun experience, a very intense experience for me. And I think for a month it was just, that was like it colored pretty much everything else I was doing. But it's also very rewarding because you come out with it with skills. And of course it depends on like what you're willing to put into it. You come out with skills that you can use for a lot of other things. And you can, come up with an essay on the fly. I like several times since then. I was asked by Midpoint Magazine, hey, like we're gonna put out a print edition. Hey, could you come up with something? And 12 hours later, I had a draft in, right? And they were like, how the heck did you do this? And I was thinking, I did this all during like rite of passage. It wasn't, I mean, it wasn't easy, but I've done this before and I can do it again. And they were like, and it was a good essay. Like, we're going to include it and all that stuff. And that ability to sort of like do this stuff and the confidence you have in doing it because you've done it so often and because you've gotten your reps in, that's not really something that you can really put a price on. And if you can get to that level, it's a wonderful place to be, but it takes a lot of work. It takes a lot of dedication. So, I would encourage everybody that's watching this video, like, go in and do it. And like, the reason why you're taking this course is to become a better writer. Well, like, put in the work to make it worthwhile.
Great answers, man. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you.